welcome. Within the DC catalog of highly regarded comic book work, there are three popular examples. The first is The Dark Knight Returns, which is the best action movie never put on film, although Zack Snyder stole as much as he could from it for Superman vs. Batman. There is Watchmen, which is the best example of the unique elements and the limitations of the comic book medium. Finally, there is Sandman, which is an example of comic books as adult literature. And then there is Flex Mentallo, which may be the best example of the medium as a serious work of surreal or abstract art. It's a piece of work that could not exist anywhere except within the pages of a comic book. First of all, let's get into the actual story itself. The plot involves Wally Sage and the comic book character he created, Flex Mentallo. While Wally trips out on a variety of drugs, Flex investigates the sudden appearance of the Fact, one of many superheroes Flex knows from his fictional past. Flex is also informed that the world is coming to an end, so by finding the Fact and the other lost heroes from his past, Flex can enlist their help and prevent this catastrophe. Meanwhile, Wally is hallucinating and thinking about a simpler time, a time before he grew up and became emotionally distant and detached from the world around him. Eventually, he recalls an encounter with a super being that explained how the universe ended and how it can be saved. By the end of the series, it's revealed that all of the superheroes Flex once knew still exist in a separate reality. They all suddenly disappeared to prevent an apocalyptic event, but they still exist, watching, waiting for the proper conditions to arise so they can return and usher in a new, better era. This separate reality exists within the cynical, older version of Wally Sage. In the end, Wally can choose to be either the destroyer or the creator of the universe he carries within himself. One can definitely be forgiven if the story seems impenetrable or oblique on the first reading. Personally, when I read this miniseries back in 1996, I couldn't decide whether it was a sublime piece of metafiction or whether it was a pile of self-involved, postmodern bullshit. Ultimately, I decided Flex Mentallo was a piece that valued creativity and escapism over realistic repercussions of violence and surface-level self-discovery. It is a commentary on, and a solution to, the grim and gritty era it exists within. I will return to this point in a moment. In a way, this miniseries suggests the superhero genre got stuck in its own relevancy. It had progressed to a point of maturity which, in turn, gave it a newfound validity. After many years of being treated as cheap, juvenile fiction, superheroes grew up, and, in the process, comic books became a recognized, credible medium. And, like a surly teenager who is angry at everything for no particular reason, it wallowed in its own self-awareness. In the process, creative escapism was sacrificed for identifiable, realistic situations and flawed characters. In other words, everything became a bit too serious. The 4 issues of the miniseries represent the various significant eras that Morrison has identified. Those eras being the Golden Age, when the superhero genre was created, the Silver Age, when the genre was highly creative, the Dark Age, where superheroes engaged in ponderous, self-involved violence, and the Renaissance, which is the era Morrison presumably desires to represent and bring into existence. As previously mentioned, Flex Mentallo is both a response to and a solution for the Dark Age of superheroes. The 3rd issue, which represents that modern era, is Flex's journey through the dark sewers of the fictional superhero world. He encounters a literal orgy of sex and violence. It's a rather savage criticism of contemporary superhero content. This miniseries is an attempt, through example, to elevate the medium past that era's miasma of grim and grittiness. Overall, it contains somewhat angry nostalgia and contempt. It recalls a time when comic books were about creativity and ideas, rather than being about self-involved deconstructionism of the superheroic figure. The solution it offers is belief. Belief in the characters themselves and what they should represent, rather than what they currently represent. It's about the future incorporating the past to become a new entity that, hopefully, transcends both. In a manner of speaking, the evolution of superhero comics through the ages coincides with the growth of the character, Wally Sage. As the genre changes, Wally changes. It's a parallel simultaneous evolution, so it's difficult to discern whether Wally is influencing the direction of the genre, or whether the genre is influencing Wally's personal growth. It's possibly a little bit of both. The point being, like the number of issues and eras represented in the miniseries, there are technically 4 versions of Wally. There is the child, the teenager, and the adult. The 4th and final version is the transformed adult. The child Wally is the one most open to creative ideas and what superheroes represent. This young Wally believes in superheroes. The teenage Wally is the one that rejects superheroes as being ridiculous. This realization is what causes the apocalypse and the destruction of the superhero universe. This is the version of Wally that turns out to be the threat known as the Absolute. Finally, there is the adult Wally. This is the Wally that tells the story in the miniseries. This adult Wally is searching for a purpose, or a reason to continue living. His salvation is the spark of creativity, the pocket universe he carries around with him. All he has to do is let it out. This will save himself and the universe of superheroes he used to adore. By doing so, he becomes the fourth and final version of himself. One moderately confusing aspect of the story is the fact that Wally and Flex's stories appear to be occurring simultaneously. However, they do not. There are times when it appears Flex's story and Wally's story overlap, but I do believe those are just clever story transitions. Wally's story takes place in the present, while Flex's story occurs somewhere in the past, after the teenage apocalypse and before the adult Wally hallucinating and remembering his life. To make matters more convoluted, the Wally Sage in Flex's reality is dead. The Wally Sage in the miniseries is an entirely different Wally in an entirely different reality. As acknowledged by Flex early on, Wally died in his arms during his Doom Patrol appearances. That being the case, it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that the adult Wally in the miniseries is a stand-in for the writer Grant Morrison. There are, after all, a few similarities between the two. For one, both are nostalgic for a simpler time, when comic books were full of creativity and joy. For another, both had a transformative experience with an alien presence. Experimentation with hallucinogens being another similarity. And, finally, both Morrison and Sage were part of a music group. The parallels aren't exact, but close enough to suggest that Wally is, to some degree, the writer's avatar. Finally, to conclude with the slightly confusing elements, Flex knows he's from a fictional universe. He knows he's the physical manifestation of Wally Sage's imagination. Much like Animal Man, Flex is traveling from one reality to another. He is also traveling through the various comic book ages, as identified by Grant Morrison. Although, unlike Animal Man, Flex is aware, on some basic level, that he is on a journey of this nature. He must remain true to himself and the spirit of his creative but absurd origin, in order to get through the ages that tempt him to alter his focus and adopt changes to his character. In other words, he resists temptation to change with the times and become a fundamentally different person. By doing so, by remaining true to his origins and retaining the creative purity that brought him into being, he's capable of connecting with and inspiring his creator, Wally Sage. Perhaps the best, simplest explanation of Flex Mentallo came from the writer Mark Waid. Mind you, despite my best efforts, I couldn't locate the exact quote or where I read it. It may have occurred during an audio interview, or perhaps it was someone else entirely. Regardless, I have always attributed it to Mark Waid. To paraphrase, he said, "I can't prove that the events in Flex Mentallo didn't happen." Mind you, one has to acknowledge this quote is logically flawed. After all, logically speaking, you can't prove a negative. That's a fundamental of objective or scientific thought. But when it comes to fiction, sometimes one must put a certain amount of logic aside for the sake of engaging in the internal logic of a story. Personally, I've always liked that statement and found it the one insight that really put the series into perspective. Within this context, Flex Mentallo can be viewed as a documentary on paper, with reenactments drawn by Frank Whiteley. I know that is a highly suspect interpretation on my part. However, in my opinion, it's not beyond the bounds of the regular suspension of disbelief one is required to engage in when reading fiction. For example, if one believes in superpowered beings, capable of an amazing array of abilities, it follows that one might accept the possibility there is a reality, unlike our own, where the laws of physics allow for such individuals to exist. Morrison adheres to the premise that there are dimensions higher than our own. These higher dimensions are nearly impossible to perceive by our limited senses. There is literally no software in our brains that can make sense of the data being sent to it from a higher dimension. For the purposes of argument, Morrison suggests this higher dimension would be hallucinogenic or dreamlike to those that perceive it. More to the point, it's this higher dimension where ideas originate. If one is open to that possibility, then it's a somewhat logical presumption that this super reality can only manifest on paper for those of us restricted to the boundaries present in this reality. In other words, this super reality needs to be translated into words and pictures onto a two-dimensional surface in order for us to process it. As an example of the point I'm trying to make, there are chairs. There is also the idea of chairs. The step between the actual physical chair and the idea of a chair is a diagram. This diagram represents the intangibility of the idea and the actual presence of a chair, yet it is neither, while simultaneously being both. Some may recognize this chair example as quantum superposition. Briefly, quantum superposition means a particle exists in a state whereby all possible outcomes are represented until it is observed, at which point it becomes one thing or another. This is commonly known as the paradox called Schrödinger's cat. To summarize this paradox, a cat within a box can either be alive or dead. Until the box is opened and the state of the kitty is determined, the kitty exists in both states simultaneously. In other words, Flex Mentallo, the comic book that is a series of diagrams representing a state of quantum superposition. It is, in essence, a diagram of Wally's mind trying to process the universe or reality where superheroes still exist. Until the comic book is opened and read, the state of that new reality is both existent and non-existent simultaneously. By reading the comic, one determines whether or not that reality does or does not become real. The premise of messing with the perception of reality is a rather consistent theme within Grant Morrison's work. With Flex Mentallo, he subtly asks the reader to accept the reality he's attempting to create. It's an approach that is many-layered and open to interpretation. Regardless, it's a very engaging element if one is predisposed to spend time pondering the nature of reality. Others that are less inclined may find this element to be pretentious navel-gazing. And, that's fair. There is, after all, a very fine line between something sublime and something utterly ridiculous. Morrison also identifies this miniseries as being part of his hypersigil trilogy, the other two parts being the Invisibles and the Filth. Since I only have a Wikipedia level of understanding concerning chaos magic, I can't speak with any authority on that topic. What this alleged hypersigil signifies and whether it was effective is likely up to an individual's perspective concerning magic. Regardless, one can reasonably presume that the teenage Wally engaging in, private activities activates a sigil that has an effect on the superhero universe. One could also argue this, private activity puts the superhero universe in a state of quantum superposition until the adult Wally opens up and looks inside himself. The miniseries is also filled with interesting elements which contribute to the overall unreal atmosphere of the story, such as the inclusion of a Kamandi lookalike who takes a new experimental drug and ends up dead on a seedy bathroom floor. The inclusion of this character seems like an odd choice, but quite honestly, I think Morrison simply likes Kamandi. After all, he is given a few moments to shine in Final Crisis. There's probably some significant parallel between Kamandi being the last boy on Earth and Wally Sage feeling isolated, but it's not one that I've given much thought to. Of course, the opening page, where the Fact, who stands unrestricted by panel borders in an empty, unformed void, throws a bomb that explodes and becomes a universe, is an appropriate beginning. As an introductory sequence, that's kind of nifty. It draws one into the story, so to speak. Another neat element is the crossword puzzle with the empty magic word. I'm probably not the only person who expected the solution to be Captain Marvel's magic transformative phrase. In the end, it's something else entirely. In a way, this symbolizes the miniseries itself. It looks like one thing, an odd superhero story, but it's actually a statement of intent by the writer. Following this miniseries, Grant Morrison's superhero content would, in essence, reject grim and grittiness and embrace creativity and big ideas. He became a living example of a writer who explores the unique, inspiring elements of the superhero genre, and he does his best to elevate the genre and the characters into a new comic book age. In the end, it needs to be mentioned that this is merely my evaluation of the material. I don't want to misrepresent it as anything other than that. Certainly, I've adapted other views I've been exposed to over the years, so some points may not be entirely unique. One may disagree with both the basis for the evaluation and the conclusions drawn along the way, or for that matter, one may see something else entirely. This difference in opinion doesn't imply either is invalid, or, for that matter, that there are degrees of validation. Flex Mentallo is a work of surreal art. It's ambiguous and open to interpretation. That is the inherent nature of art. That's it for today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will talk at you later. Until next time.